Welcome back to Chapter 26, Part 2, as we'll be taking a look at FDR and his efforts to end the Great Depression. In our last episode, we looked at some of the causes of the Great Depression, and we saw kind of the cycle of depression grip hold in the United States. And as businesses saw their inventories rising and they were creating more mechanized machinery to try to make their goods, they needed less workers. And as workers weren't making much money in the first place, they couldn't buy the goods that were being produced. And so you see this cycle of more people losing their jobs and then therefore not being able to buy the products that were being created. Especially the slow up in things like the automobile industry and the housing industry, because these are multiplier industries, which means that they're industries that kind of spur on other industries like rubber, steel, appliances, windows, paint, whatever it is, because so much goes into making these. And they're oftentimes a good indicator of how strong is the economy. Well, obviously during the Great Depression, they were quite weak. But in the 1932 election, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, or FDR, will be nominated as the Democratic candidate, and he'll go up against Hoover, where I read one time there was a note that was written to Hoover saying, Dear President Hoover, vote for Roosevelt and make it unanimous. Well, in all reality, it was a landslide victory for Roosevelt, who, as governor of New York, previously had attempted to provide more direct relief and do more things to try to tackle the Depression, something he would continue to do as president. But we also see him overcome polio in 1921, which leaves him paralyzed from the waist down and never able to walk on his own again. And people were able to kind of recognize him and sympathize with him and see how he overcame great difficulties to get to where he was. He also had the assistance of his wife, Eleanor Roosevelt, who helped him with his daily activities as president and sometimes even sat in on meetings when the president couldn't be there. And she also, kind of had her own causes that she fights for. But finally, we also see the 20th Amendment is eventually passed by Congress, which is nicknamed the Lame Duck Amendment because Hoover, after the election, stayed in office until March. And so this amendment moves up the inauguration date for presidents all the way up to January 20th. Now, once FDR is sworn in, the time period immediately after his inauguration becomes known as the first 100 days. This is where FDR will call a special session of Congress to get them working on solving the nation's problems. And really, he gets Congress to pass serious legislation attempting to provide relief and recovery to the unemployed, direct assistance, money, food, whatever it might be. And by 1935, then, he also looks to try to reform things so there never be another Great Depression. Now, FDR was a very good public speaker, and he used radio to his advantage in what becomes known as Fireside chats. This was a way for him to communicate directly to the people, to inform them, reassure them, and also gain their support. And what he would do is kind of talk directly to the people so they could hear the president's voice and understand what he was doing to try to solve the nation's problems. And one of the first things he does as president is issues a bank holiday. This is where FDR tells the nation that he's going to close down all the banks in the United States to try to stop the run on people's deposits and forcing banks to go bankrupt. And what he told them was that the government would inspect each bank, open up the good, healthy ones, and close down the weaker ones. So really, he was supporting those strong banks and letting them reopen while closing down the weaker ones, which would eventually kind of get people trusting the banks and trusting that their money was safe, which helped stem the tide of bank closings and people losing all their savings. Now, FDR, with his optimism during the election of 1932, had promised the people a New Deal. And these New Deal programs kind of became known as the alphabet agencies because they took on, acronyms like the AAA, the TVA, the PWA, CCC, and they all kind of stood for something. But what it was aimed at was to get the government spending money to try to create more jobs, provide that relief and recovery. And as more people would be hired to do different jobs, they'd have money to buy food, pay their rent, or perhaps buy consumer goods, which would hopefully kind of kickstart the economy and get it going. Not only that, but as people are making more money, there's going to be more money brought in through taxes as well. And so you see all these New Deal programs being kicked out by Congress and signed by FDR. But this is really something you're going to have to read about, all the different programs in your text that we'll talk about in class then. But to give you an idea of some of the things that FDR was creating with his New Deal programs, we turn our attention to Harry Hopkins. Now, Hopkins was in charge of kind of getting that money out to the states and out to the people, partially through one of his programs, the CWA, or Civil Works Administration. And with that, Hopkins kind of directed FDR's relief programs and even promoted African American rights, trying to give them jobs and work as well. Now, Hopkins, like FDR, did favor work relief, because that way people could kind of have an increased self-esteem and self-worth, knowing that they'd actually earned their money. And so they created all sorts of jobs like building bridges and roads and schools and sewer systems, eventually electrifying the country where electricity hadn't spread yet. But it also, kind of paid actors in different programs, paid actors to put on free shows in, city squares or parks. It paid other artists to paint murals on buildings. It even one program even paid people to walk around Washington, D.C. with balloons, scaring pigeons off the rooftops. Now, some people thought that this was a waste of money, and it became known as boondoggle, kind of wasteful spending. But when it came down to it, Hopkins said, hey, they got to eat just like everybody else. And so his job was try to spend money to get people back to work and out of the Great Depression. Another advisor to FDR was the Secretary of Interior, Harold Ickes, who was in charge of the PWA, or Public Works Administration. You can see some of the things that he tried getting built under the PWA, but he was more cautious with his spending and focused on quality and usefulness rather than just simply, the fact of spending money to get people back to work. So he wanted his programs to have a lasting legacy and benefit for the United States. And therefore, a lot of times his jobs were aimed more at the skilled unemployed, to try to, help, do things that would be beneficial, not just during the Great Depression, but even after we had gotten out of it. But out of all the New Deal agencies you'll read about, each one kind of aimed at trying to tackle some issue. FDR never wanted government to take over the major industries and kind of run everything. But at the same time, he wanted to create these programs to try to keep anything more radical from happening. And you'll take a closer look at some of these programs, like the AAA, which paid farmers to destroy crops at a time when people were suffering from malnutrition. And they did so to try to drive prices up. The CCC, which employed young men to try to build roads and plant trees and build national parks. We see other programs aimed at trying to reform the system, like the FDIC, which ensures bank deposits, so that if a bank goes bankrupt, the government will kind of reimburse you the money you had in that bank. We also see Social Security start as kind of assistance to the elderly and disabled, and regulating the stock market with the SEC. So you can kind of see there's many different things that FDR attempts to do with these programs. However, we'll take a look at in our next episode critics of the New Deal, some that said he'd gone too far, and others who said he still hadn't done enough.